So I don't think that they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective or a phenomenological perspective or a literary perspective or a metaphoric perspective. That'll do for starters.
That part of the conception of God that underlies the Western ethos is the notion that whatever God is expressed in the truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies. And that isn't all it does. It also confronts the chaos of being itself and generates habitable order.
I think science is, and again, in deference to Sam Harris, he said, don't go the way of quantum physics. I think I'm going to have to say that science is now in a process of overthrowing the climactic overthrow of the superstition of materialism. That everything that we call matter comes from something that is not material. That the essential nature of the physical world is that it's not physical. That the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff. Call it what you will.
The dogma idea. Okay, so there's the dogma incorporated in the books, but I'm going to throw away the books because the dogma was there before the books. And then the question is, where was the dogma? And the answer was, the dogma was in the cultural practices, and in the agreement that people made with regards to those cultural practices, but it was also part and parcel of the intrapsychic structure that enables us to perceive the world as such.
A transcendental internal ethic, something like that, which I would say, by the way, just since we're going down this direction, seems to me to be something very akin to the idea of the Holy Spirit, which is something like the internal representation of a transcendent universal ethic. What seems to be the case is that we have underneath our cognitive architecture and our social architecture a layer of symbolic and dramatic and narrative representation that instantiates the same concepts, but in a multi-dimensional context.
And science also tells us that nature is a discontinuity, that it's an on-off phenomenon, that there are gaps between every two ons, where you find a field of possibilities, a field of pure potentiality. Science doesn't call it God, but what is God if not the immeasurable potential of all that was, all that is, and all that will be?
I've become convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very functional cultures, or Western cultures say, are nested immovably in a metaphorical substrate. And that when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you're in the domain of religious phenomenology.
If all humanity were to cease to exist, does God still exist?
I don't think I know how to answer that. It's just, the situation is too hypothetical. I mean, I can take a crack at some of it, but so human beings are characterized by consciousness and by self-consciousness, and the latter in particular seems to be something relatively unique. There's some vague evidence for self-consciousness of lower sorts in animals, but it's not very compelling. Some of them can recognize themselves in a mirror, but our self-consciousness is accompanied by elaborated imagistic and linguistic models of ourselves and that have been elaborated over large spans of time. There are lots of elements of being that would disappear if we disappeared.
Science also tells us that this is a field of non-locality, where everything is correlated with everything else. My adversaries are going to point out, no, everything, God is explained by neurology. Your science is really frozen in the dungeons of conservatism and in the dungeons of orthodoxy. Today, science tells us that the essential nature of reality is non-local correlation.
God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time, as the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves across the longest of time frames, but are not necessarily apprehensible as objects in the here and now. So what that means in some sense is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical structure that are a consequence of processes of evolution that occurred over unbelievably vast expanses of time and that structure your perception of reality in ways that it wouldn't be structured if you only lived for the amount of time that you're going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts, because you're evanescent and you can't derive the right values from the facts that portray themselves to you in your lifespan, which is why you have a biological structure that's like 3.5 billion years old.
Everything is connected to everything else. That there's hidden creativity. There are quantum leaps of creativity. That there's something called the observer effect, where intention orchestrates space-time events, which we then measure as movement and motion and energy and matter. And addressing Sam, we can have a personal relationship with this intelligence because we have a consciousness that is part of this sea of consciousness.
If all consciousness was extinguished, the material substrate of the universe would continue unchanged. But I don't really buy that as an argument, because I think that the material substrate, I think that reality is I think that reality is an interaction between what we perceive of as the material substrate and consciousness itself. And so then when you destroy consciousness, you destroy reality. And what that leaves, I don't really understand, because it doesn't have any temporality in any obvious sense. It doesn't have any size in any obvious sense without the introduction of an invisible observer. So lots vanishes without human consciousness and self-consciousness.
Rumi, the great Sufi poet, said, you're not just a drop in the ocean, you're the mighty ocean in the drop. And all you have to do is understand the principles of science and understand that you have within you the resources to intuitively grasp this mystery.
Now, the problem is, and I think this is the central place where we need to flesh out these ideas, is that you cannot view the world without an a priori structure. And that a priori structure has a dogmatic element. And so you can't just say, well, let's get rid of the dogma, because you can't perceive the world without a structure.
But one of the things we have to do today, my friends at Caltech, you have given us this opportunity that you have to stop being the jihadists and the Vatican of conservative and orthodox science, which is not relevant anymore.
God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. That's a fundamental element of hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. That's another way of looking at it. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt. God is the future to which we make sacrifices, and something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men